Welcome to this video on skull anatomy. Today we'll be talking about the basics of skull anatomy, the functions of the skull, the standard anatomical position, and the skull from a variety of views. We're only going to be looking at the main bones of the skull and not all the little details, because I'll do a separate video about that. And we're only going to be looking at the superficial, so the outside part of the skull, and we won't look inside it yet. So this is just a basic overview. So, basic facts about the skull. There are 22 bones of the skull, and these are not including the ossicles of the ear, which we'll learn about later, or the hyoid bone. All these bones are connected by something we call sutures. And sutures are essentially just immovable fibrous joints. And sutures are what connect bones together. If we consider the actual skull, the skull in itself consists of two parts, the cranium and the mandible. And the mandible, interesting fact, is the only part of the skull that's actually movable. So you can move it around, but the other parts are kind of fixed in place. The cranium itself is made up of two parts, one of them being the calvaria, and the other one is the viscerocranium. Viscerocranium. The calvaria is the bit over here that you can see, and it essentially just encases the brain. So it's the part that encases the brain. Whereas the viscerocranium is what you can see when you look at someone's face. So it's this bit, obviously not including the mandible. So we always exclude the mandible, and it's kind of like your facial bones. Now, remember how we said that there were 22 bones at the beginning? So 8 of them make up the calvaria, 13 of them make up the facial bones, and the mandible is just one bone. So we have the calvaria up here and around the back encases the brain, viscerocranium, which is your facial skeleton, and then we have your movable mandible. So yeah, and obviously we know that the skull in itself is a bony structure. Okay, next. Now let's consider the functions of the skull. So the main function of the skull is probably pretty obvious. It protects the brain. Protects brain. Other functions include support for face. So it supports all the facial muscles and things like that. It also supports sense organs, such as hearing, smell, taste. It supports sense organs, and it provides passage for respiratory and digestive tracts. So the digestive tracts would be your mouth opening, and then respiratory would be your mouth and your nasal cavity. Yeah, so that's about it. It also has other functions, such as helps attach certain muscles, such as muscles of facial expression, which we'll go into later. So this is muscles of facial expression. And it helps protect sensitive parts, so protect delicate tissues, including like your ear and your eye, things like that. And yeah, and it also obviously bears the sockets for the eyes. For the eyes and the teeth, because these two bones here are where the teeth attach to. They give attachment to these bones here. Okay, next let's consider the standard anatomical position. So, standard anatomical position. Okay, this is a universally accepted way of describing or observing the body, and it allows doctors and healthcare professionals to be precise and consistent when they talk about anatomical references. So either references if you refer a part of the body to another part, or if you just refer the part of the body as a whole. Now, if we describe this, in this skeletal view, we can see that the person is standing upright. Okay, so no slouching, nothing like that. Facing forward. The eyes are facing forward. So the eyes are looking straight at you. The feet are flat on the floor. Arms are at the side. And the palms are forward. You can see here, the palms are actually forward. And the thumb here is furthest away from the body. So the palms are open, flat, and facing forward. So they're facing towards you. So that's the overview of the standard anatomical position. Now, let's consider the position terminology that we'll require for this video. So if someone is looking at you straight on, they're looking at you and you're looking at them and you can see like all the front of their body, that's called the anterior view. You're looking at them anteriorly. And anterior essentially just means front. So if you look at something's anterior surface, it means you're looking at the front surface. The opposite of anterior is posterior. So if you look at something's posterior surface, you're looking at the back view. So it's just back. So here we can see the back of the head. So that will be the posterior surface of the head. Posterior just means the back. Next we have the side view, and this is called the lateral view. So a lateral surface would be a side surface. And this just means side. As we can see here, we can see the side profile, so that would be lateral. If you look at something from above, it's called superior, and just means looking down on something. And you can remember this quite easily because if someone looks down on you, they kind of consider themselves as being superior. It's kind of like a form of speech. So they consider themselves as being superior. So the superior view is when you're looking down at something, like a bird's eye view. And the opposite of superior is inferior, when you're looking up at something. You're looking up at it. It's like the view of the base. So if you're looking up, if you feel, when they say, oh, I feel inferior to someone else, it means you kind of feel below them. So it's from the bottom up. So right now we can see the feet here, the bottom surface of the feet. So it's kind of like, it looks like the skeleton is standing on us essentially, but that's the bottom surface. That's the inferior view. It's from the bottom. Okay, now let's actually consider the bones of the face. We're not going to go into the foramen. We're not going to go into the little details. We're going to go into the overall bones of the face. And in later videos, I'll do like a descriptive video of the other things. So the main bones that we can see here, we have the massive bone here, which is the frontal bone. And you can remember this really easily because anterior just means front, right? So the frontal bone is quite big and it makes up the front surface. So this is the frontal bone. And there's only one of these. So there's only one frontal bone and it's quite large. Okay, next, directly under the frontal bone, we have the nasal bones. Here, just outlined with my pen. These are called the nasal bones. and they make up essentially the bridge of the nose. And I said bones because there are two of them, two nasal bones. Okay, and then we have, just below that, we have a really important bone, especially in dentistry. It's extremely important, and we'll go into detailed anatomy of this in a later video. This is called the maxilla, and it's essentially your upper jaw. Maxilla, and you have two that you can see are kind of fused down the middle. They're actually originally fused in bone, but they're technically two maxilla. Right next to the maxilla, we have them on either side of the maxilla. You have these two bones here, and these two bones are called the zygomatic bones, and you have two of them, and they're essentially cheekbones. So the zygomatic bones are your cheekbones. Okay, next we have the this here, these two little bones. They're kind of sticking out. They look like little tusks. These are called the inferior means below, inferior nasal concha, or concha. And it's called inferior because it's very hard to see, but if you can see this little outline here, so if you can see this bit, that's what we call the middle nasal concha. So this would be middle nasal concha, and the inferior is obviously below that. So we have two inferior nasal conchas and we have two middle nasal conchas. Okay, right next to that, it's really hard to see in this description, but we'll see it later on when we get into a little bit more detail about it. Just here, along here, is what we have is the lacrimal bone, and there's two of those, and they're kind of where your tear ducts are, so that's where your tears come out of, just in the inner corner of your eye. If we look at the orbit, so this is the orbit, this whole thing is called the orbit, like the orbital cavity, and then your nose bit would be called the nasal cavity. So if we just look at the orbital cavity, we're actually looking through it, so it's kind of like you're going in and you're looking through it. Right at the back of the cavity, you can see, if you can see this outline, this bone outline here. It's hard to spot, but we'll go into detail later on. This is called the sphenoid bone. So that's the sphenoid, and there's only one sphenoid. And right next to that, just a bit smaller, so again, we're looking at it from the back, so it will be looking through the orbit. This one here is called the ethmoid bone. And these are actually on the inside, but we can kind of see them on the outside. And then another really, really important bone here, not a part of the viscerocranium, but separate or by itself, the only movable bone is the mandible. So we have the mandible, and there's only one mandible. Okay, moving on. If we look at the lateral view of the skull, there's not that many bones that you can see here, but they're all quite big and quite important. So here, this bone, there's two of them on either side, and they're the ones that surround and encase the brain. These are called the parietal bones, and there's two of them. Then right under and below it, so at the very back of your head, we have the occipital bone. And there's only one of that. Next to that, there's the temporal bone. This is the temporal bone. And there's two of them on either side of your head. And we know what this bone is. We saw it from the the anterior view just before. This is the frontal bone. And there's only one frontal bone. Oh, this should say two, sorry for that. It should say two temporal bones. And again here, we can see the mandible. Obviously only one mandible. And here we can see the zygomatic bones. And there's two of those on either side. You can actually see the sphenoid bone here. So this part here is the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. So it's the sphenoid bone. And there's only one of that. You can also see the ethmoid bone. It's very small, this bit. So if I highlight it in my pen, that's where the sphenoid bone, that's where the ethmoid bone would be. So if we write that on there as well, it would be ethmoid. Again, this is on the inside, but you can see it. You can see like a tiny bit from the outside. Okay, moving on. Let's go to the posterior view. There's not that many that you can see on the posterior view. So like we talked about before, this is a parietal bone and this is a parietal bone. They're split into two and they're connected by this suture. We're going to look at all the sutures, foramen, all the little details in later videos. But for now, this is a parietal, and we know that we have two of those. Remember I was telling you that the bone at the back of the head just under the parietal bone, this is quite a big bone, and there's only one of them, and it's called occipital. And there's only one, it's quite big, it makes up the back of your head. In this we can also see the mandible. And obviously there's only one of that. And actually on the side, you can see the temporal bone here. These are the temporal bones. So you can't see them that much, but they are still there from the back. Temporal bones. And we have two of those. Okay. Next, from the superior view is very easy. You can only see two bones. Here we have our frontal times 1, which is just this whole area here. This is all the frontal bone. And then these are the parietal bones together, obviously separated. So each of them is a parietal bone, so together they're the parietal bones. Parietal, and there's two of those. So that's all it is from the superior view. The inferior view, if we start from the very top up here, we have this part, which is the maxilla. Because remember, you're looking from the bottom, so you can see the top part of it. There's two of those. This big arch here, this arching figure, this is the mandible from the bottom view. One of those. Then right below the maxilla, we have here the palatine bones. So the two palatine bones are separated by a suture. So palatine bones. And next to that, we have these big kind of protrusions that are coming out. They kind of look like handles. These are the zygomatic bones. And we have two of those. Now, right under the palatine bone, we have this figure here. And this is the vomer. It's right under the palatine bones. We only have one vomer. And then you can actually see the sphenoid bone a lot better in this. So this part here is all the sphenoid bone. And it's on this side as well. So this is the sphenoid bone from the bottom view. And then we have here, we have the temporal bone. temporal, 2 of those, and then at the very back, the one that's the biggest that we can see is the occipital bone. Sphenoid's only one as well. So yeah, that was the overview of the skull, and in later videos we're going to go into more about the anatomy, the difference between the axial skeleton, the appendicular skeleton, and focus especially on the detailed anatomy of the maxilla and mandible, and also consider the foramina, the fissures, and all the sutures as well. Thank you for listening.